The film which you are about to see is an account of the disaster which befell a lone trapped cave diver. Originally from Venezuela, Gustavo was a very adventurous man who frequently loved to bring his fiancée, Maria Mendoza, who was a TV producer, and their other friends along for the ride. So on July 13th, 1991, Gustavo, his fiancée Maria, and their friend Eduardo Wallis all set off in the thick Venezuela jungle for the mysterious and dangerous Riito de Acarite cave system. Originally discovered in 1973 by an unnamed British cave diver who followed a small stream inside the cave and he says leads to a subterranean river. Unfortunately though, no one has ever followed up on these stories, leaving them to be forgotten. That was until Gustavo and Eduardo found out and vowed to rediscover the underground river. There was only one problem, it seemed. Although both men were experienced divers and Gustavo was even a diving instructor, both men were only qualified to dive in the vast open ocean, not the constricting passageways of an underground cave. But foolishly, that didn't stop them from at least trying. They began their trip with having to be escorted by the local park ranger to the cave system, as they weren't too familiar with the park itself and didn't want to get lost. As soon as they got to the cave, both Gustavo and Eduardo would go over the map that they were given of the cave. And with half of the cave still unmapped, Maria was still pretty nervous about this whole thing. Not for herself, as she was staying up top, but for her fiancé and Eduardo, even going as far as saying, "Gustavo, you are looking at this like it's a piece of cake. What am I supposed to do if something goes wrong?" "Don't worry," said Gustavo. "If I get in trouble, my friends will rescue me." She then gave him a prayer on a note to La Virgen del Carmen, the Virgin of Miracles, just so she could feel better about the whole thing. And with that, they set off. They headed for the first passageway, which was about 30 feet or 9 meters below the surface. Everything was going to plan and the cave itself was dark but clear, so they were traversing it without much trouble. Well, at least in front of them was clear and safe looking. Behind them was another story. You see, normally when someone cave dives, they kick their fins from side to side instead of in a upward and downward motion like one would do in the middle of the ocean. And unfortunately, being untrained in cave diving, both men were doing exactly this. And as Gustavo looked behind him, he would notice the cave entrance disappearing as suit and mud were being kicked up unknowingly. And in a little bit of a panic, Gustavo located the guide rope they were laying out in order to find their way back to the entrance, and mistakenly pulls on it with such force that he pulls it loose, and without thinking, pulls all the access slack towards himself. And now with the horrifying realization that in all the panic, they kicked up a massive cloud of soot and mud, making the visibility in both directions, as put by Gustavo himself. It looked like we were swimming in chocolate pudding. And although they weren't cave diving certified, they were fortunately still diving certified. So both men understood that they had to stay calm in order to not make the situation any worse than it already was. Both men then very calmly swam up to the roof of the cave and luckily were able to find a pretty good sized air bubble. Though through the course of the small panic from earlier, unfortunately they were now separated. Fortunately though, as Gustavo called out to his friend, Eduardo would also be able to hear him. They then quickly began to convince each other that going any further would be a very foolish idea and decided to try their best to find their way back to the surface. And so with that, they dove back under. Still separated, as Eduardo was swimming, he was heading in the direction that he thought was best for escape, but suddenly found himself at the end of a dead end. A little rattled but still calm, he then turned around and continued swimming. As he was starting to think to himself that he desperately needed to find another air pocket just in case, he started to panic a bit, as it was getting more and more difficult to find one, or even see for that matter. Then all of a sudden, he was able to find a massive chamber with air, and for Eduardo, luck was on his side for sure, as it was the main entrance. As he surfaced, he saw Maria and called out, "Have you seen Gustavo? Is he here?" But as he said this, Maria's heart would sink into her stomach, as she would realize that something horrible must have happened, and yelled back out to Eduardo, "No, he was with you. If he's still in there, you have to go back in there and get him." She was especially upset at the fact that they weren't even gone that long, meaning her fiancé should still be near the entrance. Unfortunately though, because Gustavo pulled up the guide rope in a panic earlier, they had to come up with another guide rope in order for Eduardo to go back inside the cave and not become lost again. The only rope they could find though was a spare one that was only about 10 to 15 feet, or 3 to 4.5 meters long, meaning he probably wouldn't even be able to reach the entrance of the cave, let alone where his friend was, about 30 meters under. They didn't have to wait long though. Only 10 minutes later, Eduardo would resurface and say, "I cannot go any further. The water is too murky, and it's like swimming through mud. I don't want to get lost too." Maria's life felt like it was coming to an end, as she started thinking the worst. Thinking to herself, the last time she told him goodbye might have been the last time she ever saw him alive. Meanwhile, down in the deadly cave system, Gustavo, against all odds, is actually still alive. It would seem that when he and Eduardo were done talking in the air pocket, Gustavo would become entangled in the line and disoriented, and eventually become lost. Though not as lucky as Eduardo, who found the entrance. Instead, he found a small air pocket in one of the tunnels. Scared he might run out of air, he then set up shop in the small air pocket. He then sat quietly in the water, listening for if he could hear anybody outside. Suddenly, he thought he heard people talking and proceeded to yell. Unfortunately, no one could hear him. He knew that if he panicked though, he would be dead for sure. So he tried his hardest to stay calm. He would then try for an escape. He submerged himself, swam straight ahead, but ran into a wall. He then marked the spot with an X in the mud, letting himself know not to try that way again. He then submerged himself and tried again, this time swimming a little off to the side from the previous X, and hitting another wall. He then marked the area and came up and tried again. Slowly though, the batteries in his flashlight were running out, and before he knew it, he was feeling around in the dark to find the exit. And unfortunately, only a few minutes later also, he would be surrounded by X's, but no closer to escaping. Meanwhile, back up top, Eduardo and the park ranger take an oxygen tank and a piece of metal into the water and start banging on it to see if they can make noise to try and lead Gustavo back to the entrance. Though of course, where he's at, he's not able to hear a single thing. They would then wait the rest of the night for Gustavo to swim up, periodically trying to make noise and just hoping for the best. All the while, Maria would spend all the night pacing back and forth, going from thinking about the absolute worst thing to thinking that he actually could still be alive. By the time 5 a.m. came around, she just couldn't take it anymore. That's when Maria told Eduardo and the park ranger to hurry and drive back into town and call everyone that they knew that might be able to help him. And with that, Maria stayed in the cave entrance waiting for Gustavo while the rest went for help. As they left, she remembered looking at the stream flowing into the cave and couldn't escape the thought that he could be in there dead. Then suddenly, she remembered how only 15 years ago her brother passed away while riding on a motorcycle. The stress from it all would then make her throw up and have to sit down. When Eduardo arrived in town, he immediately called Gustavo's close friend and boss, Fernando and Drago. Fernando was the owner of the Marina Diver Shop where Gustavo was an instructor at. When Eduardo called him around 7 a.m., Fernando was in the cockpit of his small jet getting ready to take off from Caracas Airport in the capital of Venezuela. Eduardo then quickly explained the situation, although Fernando was not surprised at all, as he told Gustavo that it wasn't a good idea for this trip in the first place. Fernando then called his wife Vivian, who was an experienced cave diver originally from Florida, though she hadn't been in a cave at least 3 years, and was nowhere near qualified for a rescue attempt. But she did have someone in mind that she thought could help. She remembered one of the best cave divers she had ever met, a man by the name of Steve Gerard. She knew that the best way to get in contact with him would be to call the Spring System Dive Shop, thinking to herself if he isn't there, at least they would be able to tell her where to get into contact with him. Luckily though, just as her phone call came into the shop, Steve was about to take a class to nearby Peacock Springs. And as she was telling him the situation, he would continuously press her for more details like the temperature of the cave. About 50 degrees, she told him. That wasn't good though. Even if Gustavo had found a small air pocket for breathable air, he would almost certainly die quickly of hypothermia. Vivian then asked Steve, as long as she paid, if he could come to Miami tonight in order to catch a flight to Venezuela the next day to help. He then told her that he would try his best and that he would also find some good divers around that could also try to help. In reality though, Steve wasn't super excited for any kind of rescue attempt. Many people are known to drowning in underwater caves in Florida, and out of those, Steve was involved in at least 7 different rescue missions, and each time he resurfaced with 7 dead bodies. So he thought to himself, if I can't even rescue someone who's been missing for 30 minutes in my own backyard, how am I supposed to rescue someone who's over 1,500 miles away from me and been missing now for over 13 hours? Still determined to help though, he started calling around to see who could help him out. Not too many people were eager though, as they all thought to themselves that he was probably a goner anyway. Meanwhile, back underground, Gustavo, disoriented by spending so long in the pitch darkness, takes a look at his watch. Disheartened, he learns that he's been lost and underground for almost 24 hours. It would be at this time that he knew that his wetsuit couldn't keep out the cold too much longer, so he decided to try one more time to either find better refuge or, God willing, the exit. He then crawled around in the darkness for a bit until he came across a muddy bank. Without hesitation, he hurried up and crawled upon it and took off his wetsuit so he could use the bathroom. By this time, he was also incredibly thirsty. Though not wanting to drink the dark, dank water, he just sat there, shivering, occasionally crying out into the darkness, sometimes calling out just to hear another noise in the dark void, and other times just to keep himself awake. To keep his mind busy, he would count to 5 or 10, and every so often he would bang on his tank just in case someone would hear it. He still had one flashlight that worked, but he decided only to use it in even more of an emergency state and decided to leave it turned off every so often to save the batteries. All in all, he felt that this chamber would surely be his tomb. Meanwhile, back on the surface, one of Gustavo's friends flew in via a helicopter to try and mount a rescue mission of his own, a man by the name of Alejo Caligaro. Though just like Eduardo, he couldn't make it past the entrance due to zero visibility, so when he resurfaced, he suggested to Maria that she leave due to the fact that he definitely believed that they would be pulling up a dead body whenever the Americans showed up. Fernando then decided that it would be faster if he flew to Florida himself. He had been up since 5:30 a.m. and was exhausted from the stress of it all, but did what he had to do in order to save his friend. Steve decided to bring with him a man named John Orlowski, who was experienced in cave diving in murky water, though Steve was a little worried as John had never rescued a dead body before, and worried a little bit on how he would take the site. Even remembering back to the time where he found a body that was lodged in the ceiling of a cave, with their fingertips rubbed completely raw, trying to claw their way out of the limestone. But John quickly reassured Steve that he would be okay and not to worry. Meanwhile, back in the cave, Gustavo lost his watch trying to use the bathroom for what was about the 20th time. And now, with no concept of time, Gustavo would begin to pray to himself and periodically call out that he was still alive. But the only one who heard his cries was the black void staring back at him in his face. Just then, he was able to find his watch lodged in some mud as he was crawling around on the ground. Though as he looked at it, his heart dropped into his stomach as he noticed that it had been 2 days now since he had descended into the cave. He then thought to himself, I'm going to die down here, aren't I? Though not wanting to die of starvation or growing crazy in the dark, he felt around for his diving gear and removed a small knife that was near his pressure gauge. Thinking it would be faster, he pressed it against his wrist and began to think about life. Meanwhile, Fernando and the others are landing in the airport in Venezuela. Officials even had a helicopter ready for them, but due to heavy fog, they had to take a jeep instead. They would then arrive to the cave at approximately 7 a.m. on the 16th, 3 days after the initial descent. Prepared though, the crowd that is already there has everything Steve and John might need. They don't take long getting ready, and not before too long, they start the rescue dive. While they were down there, Steve remembers thinking to himself, who would want to dive down here? While John was thinking how impossible this was, but knowing they both had a job to do, kept moving. Just then, John would see a light off in the distance, thinking that he just swam in a complete circle and that must have been Steve up ahead. He pressed forward. Just then, he popped out of the water to see a man looking at him half dead. It was Gustavo. He was still alive, but in horrible critical condition. But he was aware of what was happening around him. So all three men started to celebrate in the cavern, as not only a minute ago, all three of them thought that Gustavo would be either soon dead, if not already. Steve then followed the guideline back to the entrance to let everyone know the good news. At first, no one really reacted, but as soon as it sank in, everyone started celebrating as well. Steve then grabbed a bottle of sugar water to give to Gustavo so that he could get his energy back up. On the final swim back to the entrance, John led the way with Gustavo right behind him, using John's spare regulator hose, and Steve maintained a grip on Gustavo so he wouldn't get lost again. Then finally, at exactly 8 a.m., 36 hours after the initial descent, the three men emerged from the cave and everyone started swarming them in a celebration. After the whole ordeal was done, Gustavo had trouble being in dark rooms by himself, stating, it felt the same as it felt in there. He was also a little bitter at his friends for leaving him in there and having to rely on Americans for help, though he did vow after to go to Florida and get his certification from Steve and one day conquer the Riito de Acarite cave system. Let me know in the comments if you would be crazy enough to do what Gustavo has done, and if so, what would you have done if you had gotten lost just like him? Thank you all for watching again, and remember to hit the like and subscribe buttons and turn on the notification bell for more content in the future. Goodbye for now.